Okay, thank you for. Okay, so as I was saying, I chose this title to speak from electroweak unification, which was the hallmark theory on which he worked, to the dreams of final theory. But I realized what an immense task it was to speak about him and his thoughts. So many things that I, and I'm sure many of my generation, imbibed, but not that we had studied him in any very great detail. So these are just personal impressions and glimpses. And as I was saying, me and several of our friends had thought that with the great energy and impetus that he gave to the subject, he was going to go well into the 90s. But we have now lost his guidance and insight. So let me begin by saying how I put together the thoughts. I just thought that I would divide them into three parts, try to say something about his physics, and I will focus primarily on the electroweak unification, and then a few things about science and society. He did outreach. He wrote that famous book, First 3 Minutes, and he has written several other science and history of science books to put science in perspective. But I will not be touching on those books at all, which probably you'll be able to read on your own. But I will try to highlight another side of him where he was, as it is written here, sort of a rationalist warrior. And then some personal glimpses as a mentor. So that's him. This is how we remember him. Roughly, this is the stage of life he was when we were with him. And if you can see a tiger about to charge, yes, that's very much him. But don't worry, he's not charging at you, because most of the time he's shooting for something much bigger, and he has very little time for most students in any kind of personal way. So to get some idea of this electroweak unification theory, I should set the stage a bit by saying how physics looked circa 1960 and 70s, because it was the decade of 1960s that most of the development that happened that allowed the electroweak theory and the standard model of particle physics to emerge in late 60s, early 70s. So speaking of 1960s, new accelerators were being built. Primarily, there is the whole background story of the bomb, the Manhattan Project, and America had emerged from the Second World War with immense developments in technology and also immense brain power that it had got both from within United States and a large number of the absolutely top level scientists of Europe. And so there was a huge forward towards achieving newer and newer heights, and new accelerators were being built, which were now reaching the proton rest mass, which is 1,000 electron, 1 giga electron volt. And by comparison, electron rest mass is a half a MeV. So most of the conventional energies that we see are much lower than that. And I have just listed here that, so the new accelerators were producing this plethora of new particles, which we broadly call hadrons. And there are various Greek names for them, pi, delta, k, and each one with various charge levels and so on, psi. And then I've put an arrow and an omega. I will tell you a little bit more about that. But the point was, there was a huge zoo, as they called it, even the people of that time called it a zoo of particles suddenly. And it was a big confusion as to how to classify them, how to understand their force laws and so on. The real problem was that nuclear forces had now been kind of explored for about 2 or 3 decades, but there was not much handle on them. You studied many different nuclei, but it was impossible from studying the binding from the spectra of nuclei and their excited states to understand what their force laws were, what was binding together the neutrons and protons inside the nuclei. The other very interesting theoretical development that had happened was quantum electrodynamics, the theories of Feynman and Schwinger and Feynman diagrams, which now every child knows about, space-time diagrams. And all these great personalities were around. And the program of QED, as it is called, seemed to be mostly completed. But at the same time, an outgrowth of that, a generalization of that as a relativistic quantum theory, which was called quantum field theory, somehow a sentiment had set in that quantum field theory was dead. And that had to do with how QED had to be handled. Quantum electrodynamics required what is called renormalization. And it looked like some mathematical jugglery, and there were several unreliable parts of that whole program, which led the great physicist Davidovich Landau to declare that quantum field theory is dead in some international conference. And so these approaches to understanding nuclear forces were all getting choked. That is what the bottom line is. And the only things that people could rely on were fairly limited tools, from just the mathematics of symmetries and of basic principles of quantum mechanics, the mathematical formulation of quantum mechanics, which roughly you can say in 2 parts. One was the, like we calculate spectra of molecule excited states based on the basic states, and by symmetry arguments, if this state exists, then that must exist, and so on. And the other thing was just conservation of information, unitarity. We do integral psi star psi equal to 1. So these were, of course, in a sophisticated format, but these were the only things there were. And amazingly enough, even using these, the famous physicist Murray Gell-Mann had guessed, that slide went away, but that omega particle that I had written, Gell-Mann was managed to use even these crutches to arrive at some properties of predict the existence of that omega. But overall, the situation was very bleak because there was no real underlying theory of the force laws, and the tools were very limited. So to move on, by the way, please feel free to raise a question. It can be even in between, or if it is not possible to immediately answer, I will postpone it, but feel free to raise it, except that I cannot see anything because I'm seeing the whole slide filling my screen. So maybe Uma or Soumya may please direct the question to me. It looks important enough. So you could maybe put it in chat box or just raise your hand if you think it is urgent enough, and I'll be happy to answer so that you understand what is going on. Okay, so to understand what this electroweak theory was all about, I will try to just highlight some of the background that went into it. One of the most interesting developments that happened soon after the discovery of cosmic rays and the early understanding of nuclear forces was this very interesting idea by Hideki Yukawa that when you really do relativistic quantum theory, you can no longer use the sort of potential function V of x. We write Schrodinger equation with a potential energy function V of position. But this doesn't make sense in special relativity, because if V is function only of x, then if you do a Lorentz transformation, it will become function of x as well as t, and so on. So potential theory was just not useful for dealing with relativistic force laws. And Yukawa came up with this interesting idea that really you must replace this intermediary potential between particles. So here, can you see my pointer?
Yeah.
So here neutron scatters and becomes proton. So neutron and proton are coming in from the left and going out as neutron and proton, but they kind of get exchanged. And so there would be, normally there would be some potential function here which would cause this scattering, like say Rutherford scattering. But Yukawa said, well, think of it as a particle being exchanged. So you can then consider all the possibilities, the reverse reaction of that, neutron and proton going into, now neutron getting converted to proton. Then, so here, if we are going from left to right, a pi minus, a negatively charged particle would have to be emitted by the neutron. Then it becomes a positively charged particle to do charge balance. But that pi minus would be absorbed by proton and it would become neutral. And vice versa, where going forward in time, here it would have to emit pi plus. But there would also be a neutral meson, pi zero. So this, of course, all of us who have studied a bit of quantum mechanics know that the spin states come in 2L plus 1 projections. So if it is internal spin 1, then there would be plus minus as well as a zero state. So Yukawa had this beautiful idea that you do not have to consider a space distributed, static background potential, but it is all happening dynamically, so that everything is local. This gets emitted here, gets absorbed here, and then you can make it all consistent with special relativity because everything is local. So that was one paradigm. And I've written there, it was effectively, I think, So it was sort of the beginning of quantum field theory, because you created and destroyed particles. And that is how quantum mechanics progressed. You did not normalize your wave function to 1 for all time. In fact, there was not just one particle living forever. If there was one neutron to begin with, well, it was going to split into a proton and a pion. The neutron is gone here. Okay. Similarly, at this vertex, proton is gone, but then neutron gets created. So that was the framework called quantum field theory. And this was essentially the beginning of interacting quantum field theory idea. And a mathematical formalism had to be set up for this whole thing to work. The second paradigm was to deal with the particles between which these forces acted. So on the previous page, I showed neutron and proton, but really the story that we are going to deal with is the story of electron and neutrino, the very light particles. Those were hadrons, which are in the GeV range, whereas what we will deal with is humble MeV and actually is more or less zero mass of the neutrino. So this very light particles, leptons, their story was gleaned by these people. Firstly, Yang and Lee, very young people at that time, Yang probably just about 30. Lee, T.D. Lee, the younger person. So these people understood that some of the things that I wrote, K, Psi, delta, blah, etc. The King-Meson story actually suggested that actually parity was not conserved. Handedness in quantum mechanics, in quantum field theory, somehow, in the particle, in the weak force case was not conserved. So they guessed this, but to be sure, because it was such a crazy idea to say that handedness is not a valid symmetry in fundamental particle physics, whereas it is an obvious symmetry in most of the nature we have, they suggested to a colleague, Madam C.S. Wu, to do a particular experiment. And I mean, surely they must have collaborated to zero in on what experiment she could possibly do. And I will not be able to explain all the elements of the cartoon here, but basically the cartoon is supposed to show that if you mirror reflected, then you don't get mirror reflection in a naive way, but it kind of flips in a particular way. So what Madam Wood discovered was that all the emissions from from polarized nuclei would all go in one direction. All electrons one way, all neutrinos the other way. And it would flip, but not the way you would expect, because there was no fundamental anti-neutrino. Either there was a neutrino, left-handed neutrino, or a right-handed anti-neutrino. But there was a left-handed neutrino, but no right-handed neutrino. And these things were called chiral, actually. The handedness is called chiral for massless case. And these developments led Marshak and Sudarshan to actually give a field theoretic description in the sense of Yukawa, where you create and destroy particles. But what they did was they could set up the chiral projection operator and then suggested that the structure of the weak force could be written as a quantum field theory, and it had a specific form called vector minus axial vector, exactly, and only left-handed chiral electrons would enter into charged weak interactions. So this theory, Marshak and Sudarshan wrote down. All this happened just like in the blinking of an eye. This C.N. Yang and Lee proposed in 1956, I think, that this must be violated. They told her she was the real, as they called her, Madame Curie of her time. Within 4, 5, 6 months, she finished this very difficult and almost unexpected result experiment, so that by next January, these people could publish, and their paper got published. By end of 1957, Lee and Yang got Nobel Prize, probably one of the fastest Nobel Prizes. I think T.D. Lee was only 32 years old. And Marshak-Sudarshan theory was developed at the same time, but it never actually got published because Marshak, a senior man, had slight hesitations about the correctness. But everyone credited them with it because he gave set of lectures on it afterwards, and it was part of George Sudarshan's PhD thesis submitted at Rochester. So that was paradigm 2, the knowledge about neutrino and electrons. The third thing that went in was something much deeper in a sense, very, very elegant, called gauge invariance. And it went back to Einstein's general theory of relativity, where Einstein, as shown in this right upper diagram here, Einstein wanted to basically realize that the most elegant description of gravitation is that we don't speak of inertia anymore or inertial frames. We know inertial frames were the cornerstone of Newton, Galileo, basic dynamics. There were this special class of frames in which nothing would happen. Things would just keep moving without any disturbance if there was no force acting on them. But Einstein realized that that is not the correct thing to use. In fact, every observer, so putting together special relativity and the force, the equivalence principle, the equivalence of inertial and gravitational mass, Einstein suggested that every observer PQ at any point in the space-time is free to choose whatever frames of reference he likes. And you could set up any curvilinear coordinate system. You didn't have to stick with inertial ones. So that would, of course, give rise to some kind of pseudo forces, but there was a very specific way that you could pick out the gravitational forces, which were due to the space-time metric tensor, which Einstein introduced. So somehow inertial forces and rigid transformations were out, and local transformations. At every point, you are free to orient your frame whichever way you liked. And the laws of physics remain invariant under any such transformations. The equations had to be written in, could be written up in such a way, provided you introduce the metric tensor, that they remain invariant. Now there is a bit of history in between that to Hermann Weyl, which is Kaluza-Klein theory, where people tried to think of a fifth dimension because they thought the only thing now remaining is the electromagnetism. And we know it is described by a potential, vector potential and a scalar potential. So these can be combined into a 4-vector. And maybe that was a fifth dimension which you could not fully explore. Hermann Weyl had a slightly cleverer idea that directly fitted electromagnetism, which is shown below, where in addition to this freedom of these tangent vectors, you had at every point an inner space, which I have shown as circle. I will tell you why it is a circle. I mean, in fact, it could be an inner space that was also indefinitely long, like the real space-time. But what Hermann Weyl realized was that you had to invent this auxiliary space. And all of us who have done electromagnetism, even our IIT introductory course, know that there is something called gauge invariance. You can shift the gauge potentials by derivatives of a vector potential or a scalar potential. And the equations don't change. So that degree of freedom, we do grad lambda or d by dt lambda, those things, that lambda is what this circle is supposed to represent. Instead of drawing an indefinite line, we have shown only a circle because when we really use it in quantum mechanics, it appears only as a phase in the exponent. So only it's modulo 2 pi. It's defined modulo 2 pi. But there is this extra quote dimension into which we don't propagate. This is the clever thing that Hermann Weyl realized. But it exists. So and every observer is free to choose the 0 of that circle, theta equal to 0 of that circle as they like over the whole manifold. So this freedom, Hermann Weyl called gauge freedom. There's gauge in gauge. For us in India, it sounds like some railway thing, but it is not the railway gauge. About measurement. And actually it is about phase scaling. Now, this was generalized by Yang and Mills, the same Yang whose picture was on the previous transparency, in 1957 to more general groups. The U1 is a abelian group, but SU2 and other groups. It remained an abstruse theory which not many people studied, I would guess. It was purely mathematical theory, but basically Yang and Mills tried to propose that for the nuclear force, perhaps this is how the nuclear force works. What is interesting is that if you do this local gauge invariance, then you get exactly massless spin 1 mediators. Right? This Yukawa thing that we saw earlier with mediator pi plus positive and negative pi 1 and pi 0. In this picture, they would not be spinless like pions, but they would be spin 1 like photon. They would put and they would be strictly massless. That is what the package deal of gauge invariance was. If you want this freedom to redefine the phase or choose gauge everywhere, then but then we are happy with that because that's what the photon is. The photon is exactly massless to the extent we know. So it fitted this theory very well. Just to say an additional point, what is amazing is that the mathematicians on their own track reached the exact same idea, what Yang-Mills were doing in 1957 in exactly the same year or plus minus one. Ehresmann, who was from the group of Élie Cartan, proposed exact same thing, but of course in a language that even till date physicists will find difficult to understand, but it says exact same thing. So this construction emerged both within physics and in pure mathematics at the same time, except that in physics there was a great force, there was a great motivation to apply it to nuclear force. But not many people could see how to do it, because then two things were wrong. The pions had mass of some 135 MeV, whereas here it would be exactly massless. Secondly, pions were spin 0, whereas here you needed spin 1. Of course, nuclear physics does have spin 1 vector mesons as well, but that theory won't fit. So you were in a tantalizing situation. You had some theories which were coming close, but they were not quite fitting. And then there was paradigm number 4, which finally clinched the issue for everyone. And this started again a little early. I forgot to write the years, but Nambu and Goldstone around 1960-62, they proposed symmetry breaking inspired by superconductivity. And interestingly enough, the superconductivity theory given by Landau, no other than Landau. So the Landau-Ginzburg theory of superconductivity is what motivated Goldstone to develop a relativistic theory of a massless particle, because superconductivity can be thought of as, it is gapless. So it takes zero energy to make any excitation. That's why the current keeps flowing forever. Nambu had a slightly more complicated field theory model, but essentially proved the same idea. And everyone was busy trying to apply these things to the strong force, because Yang and Mills also had thought it applies to strong force. Somehow now things were emerging, but then you needed spin 1, but this was spin 0, but at least you got masslessness. So there was quite a bit of excitement. And this excitement was topped by these people, Peter Higgs, and I've written plus because it's a slightly longer list, and they all worked independently. So there are 3 groups. Higgs all on his own, and then Guralnik, Hagen, and Tom Kibble, and in France, Francois Angler and Braur. These 3 people independently, because everybody was beginning to ask field theory questions, this emergence of massless particles, the proofs were not perturbative. So there were some non-perturbative proofs. And people were arguing over whether this thing is possible based on those very general principles, on the basic principles of quantum theory. These people managed to show that actually, if you took this Nambu-Goldstone model and put it together with Yang-Mills symmetry, then you got, very interestingly, spin 1 and massive particles, but hidden behind it, you still had the Yang-Mills symmetry. So you had won a big victory, because you had that great gauge invariance originating from Einstein's general covariance principle. That symmetry was still underwriting your efforts, but you got out of this a massive and spin 1 mediator. So now, of course, again, things looked a bit wrong, because if you are trying to get massive, meaning pion, well, pion was spin 0. So either you had spin 0, a massless particle of spin 0, or massive particle but of spin 1. But there was a proposal by Schwinger earlier, where he had proposed that weak force will be explained by massive spin 1 mediators. This whole mechanism had a very distinct signature, and you already saw, because I made the mistake of clicking this slide, the unmistakable signature of this slightly complicated arrangement of Goldstone bosons and Yang-Mills theory together would be a leftover scalar massive particle, which is what we call the Higgs boson. And all the excitement and $10 billion expenditure and so on, and it is still ongoing. The $10 billion experiment that got launched was to discover that particular signature of this particular mechanism, the Higgs mechanism. So how do Weinberg and Salam enter in this? This phrase of Weinberg has sort of become popular because he said that in his Nobel acceptance speech. Driving one morning to MIT, I realized that this whole picture was meant to fit not the strong force, but the weak force. So everybody was trying to fit pions or some other kind of hadrons to fit with that spin one massive particles and explain nuclear, the strong force. And of course, strong was the much more important force because plethora of hadrons were being discovered. Whereas neutrino was still elusive and nobody was really interested. But what Weinberg could show that actually it fitted the chiral leptons that Sudarshan and Marshak had identified, that field theory actually got intermediary particles now, which would exactly complete the theory. And Weinberg was the one who chose the specifics that predict exactly one Higgs boson of mass comparable to W and Z masses. In a sense, the Higgs boson that got observed at CERN was predicted by Weinberg and not by any of those people, because those people were actually just giving a field theoretic mechanism that too applicable primarily, with motivation, of course, being strong force. So it was Weinberg's detailing of this whole set of ideas that gave him the prediction of one Higgs boson. And what he emphasized was renormalizability. So this renormalizability, which we mentioned in connection with quantum electrodynamics, actually came back and it came useful. So the advantages of Yang-Mills symmetry, which was underwriting this whole endeavor like a big bank. The bank guarantee was Yang-Mills symmetry, and that permitted renormalizability. And this observation also Weinberg made in his famous 1967 paper, A Theory of Leptons. And he sent it off and forgot about it. Most people didn't notice that paper because nobody was too keen on weak interactions at that point. And it used, I also suspect that not many people were very familiar with Yang-Mills theory at that time. It is a big jump like general relativity. You do require some kind of mathematical intuition and facility to grasp it. And so it's very likely that a lot of people hadn't studied it in much detail. And that Yang-Mills will fit so nicely with this spontaneous symmetry breaking. And it will fit leptons. People had not made that connection. However, Abdus Salam, one of the most, equally energetic and pioneering physicists of second half of 20th century, the post-renormalization generation, had actually seen that this works. It is interesting. I have prepared some transparencies, but then I decided to drop them. But it is interesting that both Salam and Weinberg were the only two people who added to renormalization theory after it was mostly finished. There were people who put it on a formal footing, Bogolyub, Paraschiv, and so on. But from a very practical point of view, certain lacuna were actually fixed by Salam and separately another one by Weinberg. So these were the people who were at it. Similarly, when Goldstone came up with this idea of massless bosons based on superconductivity, it was Salam and Weinberg who got together with him to write a Goldstone, Salam and Weinberg paper. that proved Goldstone conjecture from non-perturbative field theory. So they were both on the ball in a way, and they were both probably inspired by the same set of ideas, and they arrived at this thing at the same time. Salam, however, was, from the stories I've heard, he was always brimming with ideas, with lots of mathematical ideas all the time. And lot of them he didn't bother to write. For example, that the chiral neutrino that we talked about, Salam had thought of it, and Salam knew that you could write a 2-component theory instead of 4-component Dirac theory, a 2-component chiral theory for the neutrino. But he happened to talk to Wolfgang Pauli, and Pauli said, "Are you mad? You want to sink your career?" So then Salam, backed down, and he didn't publish that theory. So Salam had been on to all of the essential things as well. And he, along with many things he taught in a seminar course at Imperial College, he said, look, this is one way that it might fit and the weak interactions might work. He just taught it as part of the course. It is said that Salam used to catch people in the corridor and give them ideas and say, hey, look, this might work. Why don't you work it out? So somewhat in that vein, he simply mentioned it in his course that, look, this method may also work. And people in the class, some people had been reading Physical Review, and so somebody spotted that in Physical Review letters, Weinberg has published exactly same idea. And they told Salam that, look, go and look, there's an article by Weinberg. And many years later, I heard this reported by one of the students, Del Burgo, who was present, who was his, he says they went down with him to the library with Salam. And they say when Salam opened PRL and saw this paper, he went white because he had thought of exactly the same thing, but he had not published it. Luckily, Salam's reputation stood in good stead. And Weinberg, Salam, and Glashow, all three of them got the Nobel Prize for electroweak unification in 1979. I have not been able to explain what exactly was the Glashow's contribution, but it was also pivotal. But it would take us too far afield into physics if we do that. Let me just mention here briefly that Salam साहब यहाँ पर वो पठानी dress पहन के बैठे हैं. He wanted to show to the world that he came from a different culture, which had its own validity and its own ethos and ability to contribute to the top level science. And all his life, he also struggled to establish that connection, but it's a program that is still ongoing. So just to summarize this whole thing, I've already exhausted 45 minutes, but it's okay. Why we consider this such an important development, and I will not bore you with all the details written on this transparency, but primarily just as James Clerk Maxwell in 1855, roughly, I think around then, I think it was a book, put together several laws, Ampere's law, Faraday's law, Coulomb's law, and the interlacing magnetic and electric effects. And he put together the combined laws of electromagnetism, including adding that missing term, so that it came to such an elegant conclusion. It closed the electromagnetic theory. In the same way, Weinberg and Salam put together these various elements that were around in an intelligent way and formulated what we now call electroweak. If electromagnetism brought together electric and magnetic, now we see that electric and magnetic are also intertwined with the weak nuclear force. And we call this the electroweak theory. So that ends the first slightly longish part of my talk. Is there any question? Okay. So if not, I will move on. So just a few other ideas and proposals from Weinberg, just to give you a glimpse of the whole personality. in physics, his role in physics. He was one of the persons who also proposed proton decay. He was not alone, but he certainly implemented a fairly specific model and identified some of the physical elements that would go into achieving, so proton decay certainly was his idea, along with Georgi and Quinn. Glashow and Georgi had proposed a unified model, but what Weinberg could show using mathematics with these people was that it actually led to proton decay and could predict the rate at which protons should decay. But of course, at a very, very slow rate, less than 10 raised 1 in 10 raised to 30. The half-life would be about 10 raised to 30 or 32 years. He also worked on dynamical origin of baryon asymmetry, emphasized actually I mixed up, so this is what I meant to say first. I began to say first, the elements that go into producing the baryon asymmetry of the universe. And he also electrified the world with his neutrino mass term, which was the lowest hanging fruit that could be got beyond the standard model without disturbing most of the rest of the standard model. So the so-called dimension 5 term of Weinberg. And supergravity phenomenology. I'm just skimming things. I mean, his work is prolific. He has generated so many ideas, but the ones that come to my mind now. And so the role of gravitino in cosmology and how to set up the supergravity model so that it is the most elegant and simplest and so on. A lot of people worked on those ideas. Any of these papers has 1,000 citations. But I should also add that none of these has yet been verified. As you know, the Higgs boson, which he predicted in 1967, took about 40 years to be found. Similarly, these ideas, in what way they may be realized or not, is still open, but the precise manner in which he has put forward these ideas has given all of us our lifetime's work. We are all working away on various variants and improvements on these ideas that got proposed, not only by him, certainly, but he was one of the drivers of these ideas. And we are all working essentially within the same gamut of ideas, trying to come up with something new. The grand unified gut baryogenesis is now actually understood to be not viable. Protons are not decaying till date, despite the Super-Kamiokande experiment. Katrina experiment at Karlsruhe might find the kind of mass term that he proposed for neutrino. And supersymmetry, certainly the dream seems to have really got postponed. It's become a mirage now. It might be true, but certainly we are not going to see it anytime soon. It seems very unlikely. But certainly all these ideas are the bread and butter of all the entire community of people working in phenomenology. So he was really instrumental in all of them. The other things that one may remember him for are the scientific speculations he made. So it sort of went slightly out of the way into the speculative zone, but rooted within the science. You know, string theory is in that domain right now. Everybody is debating whether it is, it can be accepted as a physical theory in the sense that with some modification and improvement, it will fit or not. So it's a big debate and he has taken sides in it. But I can tell you here a slight personal story that in 1983, Salam came to UT Austin to give us colloquium. And Salam emphasized, at that time, strings had not yet caught on and supergravity was the rage. And Salam mentioned that he has discovered that it would be n equal to 8, whatever that means, 8 supersymmetry generators, n equal to 8 in D equal to 11, 11 dimensional n equal to 8 supergravity is what is the final theory. And I do remember Salam also mentioning as a joke that it is interesting to note that D equal to 11 is not a holy number for any of the major religions in the world, and he has found it to be the valid one. And at that time, Weinberg also joked that even if he was not so keen on supergravity, the fact that Salam worked on it so feverishly dragged him to work in it. And he says, we can't be sitting around while Salam gets into this. So that's why I also have to kind of catch up with him. And Weinberg gave a set of lectures in 1986 while the string theory was just catching on. It was just taking off. But Weinberg gave a fully pedagogical course in 1986, a course which even George Sudarshan sampled some of the lectures. And after one of the lectures, Sudarshan told me, Weinberg is a rishi. He really sees beyond the symbols, really understands physics at its core. The other thing that Weinberg went into sort of on the speculative limb was the anthropic principle, because cosmological constant is a big conceptual issue in general relativity. And many people have been proposing that whatever the world is has been made such that we human beings come into existence. So if that is how it is, then the world has to be like this. Because if there was a cosmological constant, galaxies, I mean, at any reasonably large value, then no galaxies would form and we would not be around to observe the universe. And they actually associate something mystical with it, in the sense that universe was meant to be observed by man, whatever that means. So Weinberg did a clever thing of, he rephrased the anthropic principle into saying, well, at least the cosmological constant cannot be so large that we don't come into existence, because then there would be nobody to see it, verify this. But that doesn't leave out the possibility that cosmological constant is there, but so small that it would not affect galaxy formation. And in this way, he managed to guess an order of magnitude number for what is the cosmological constant, and which now we call dark energy. It kind of was just below the bound that he gave. I don't think he meant it to be any kind of a prediction, but many people are very impressed that this clever straddling of these two issues allowed him to guess that if at all there is a one, look for it at this value. And it did get found. People call it now dark energy because we don't understand it very well. But this was one of the interesting things that he got engaged with. The other thing I find interesting is that string theory, and this is a long story by itself, but at present, the reason why string theory is in a bit of doldrums is because actually it predicts a huge number of possibilities for universes, which removed some of its appeal, because people thought that string theory would uniquely give the world we live in. And so from some mathematics, we would see that this is uniquely where we were supposed to be. But that doesn't happen. And then the other people like Susskind and proponents of this picture are saying that, well, so what, you know, it's just that we are in one of those infinite number of possibilities. But then there could be out there other universes where other kinds of coupling constants and other kind of matter are occupying that universe. So it's become a big debate, because it's non-scientific. If that world you are never going to see, then why would you say that that world exists? So here again, Weinberg has, I think, taken the stance that if mathematics deems it is right, then even if it's unseeable, it should be there, which seems a reasonable argument. But if we are never going to see it, then of course it has no phenomenological value. At the same time, I'm just saying how he engaged with the intellectual arguments that are ongoing in our time. And then this is his important position that he has taken as to the status of physics we have now, which I'm sorry, he has so many books, I have not been able to read any of them. But I catch from here and there, from reviews and occasional reading and his statements in various fora, that this is what he thinks of the final theory, that we are essentially within the Newtonian paradigm, you know, the mathematical philosophy. Using mathematics, we are gleaning the principles of physics And for some uncanny reason, physics does remain amenable to the kind of mathematics we are able to handle. And with the arrival of something so sophisticated as string theory, he thinks that there could be some key observations that would actually finish all of physics as we know. The problems of quantum gravity may get solved, the problem of what is the Big Bang may get resolved, and the problem of, entanglement, entropy in quantum theory of in presence of gravity. They may all get resolved if we get enough observables and enough hints as to how to string it together in mathematics. So all the phenomena may come under complete control and finish the paradigm of Newton. That is what that is the position he has taken, and that is what he means by there could be a final theory. But if one of the interviews that I happened to see, so mathematical philosophy of nature would come to a completion. But I came to this quote. So I'm really, all these words are essentially paraphrasing of his position on it, the way I understand them. And I think he makes a comment somewhere that, we are still too far from it. But then this century is still long, and some of you listening to this are very young, so maybe you will see or not. And the other, it's already 5 o'clock. I will go quickly on the next two transparencies because they're more to do with his slightly strident approach to getting, this is very important, but it's still within physics. So people who are in particle physics will probably appreciate some of this. As I said, he didn't just solve various problems or just create theories. He also had mission in life to simplify physics and to prune it down to fewer principles. It's somewhat similar to the exercise that is in mathematics. They're always trying to clarify, refine, and minimize the axioms from which to derive everything. So one of the things that Weinberg could actually get down to was there is no relativistic quantum mechanics other than quantum field theory. So in a sense, QFT is the universal tool for dealing with all relativistic quantum theories, ideas, and phenomena. And this really says farewell to wave equations, which is still somehow the syllabus of many quantum 3 courses. People spend a lot of time studying wave equations. And there was this whole program of current algebra and S matrix and so on. He could recast everything there was in the language of field theory, if needed, what he called effective field theory. So and even string theory ultimately would manifest to us only in the language of quantum field theory. So quantum field theory really is the universal tool. This has been mostly emphasized by him. And it also ironically puts paid to Landau's pronouncement, quantum field theory is dead. Well, it's now completely the other way around. Quantum field theory is the only tool we know by which to do calculations if needed by going to lattice and so on, but it's still functional methods, it's quantum field theory. So it turns out that unless string theory proves right and we have to use newer mathematical techniques, QFT remains and even if you have string theory, ultimately you'll calculate using QFT. So that's really an amazing development of which he was one of the greatest proponents and actually brought into existence the tools needed. The other interesting thing he did was to show that consistent quantum field theory of massless particles automatically implies gauge invariance. So to a lot of people, Weil's idea and this general covariance idea of Einstein and so on are sort of, mystical and divine principles and so on. He really wanted to be an iconoclast. He just wanted to say, look, it's all internally consistent and you may consider it a very elegant principle, but it really is required by quantum mechanics. So that is somewhat the spirit in which some of the papers in the mid-60s were written, and they're part of his quantum field theory 1 and 2. His quantum field theory part 1 basically does what I've written above, RQM equal to QFT, where you do not start with wave equation and try to quote quantize them, but instead you simply start with the program the way he thinks it. And the third thing, major thing, was similar exercise with general theory of relativity. He said, well, it's just basically classical field theory with a gauge invariance. And geometry is just an analogy. So the next few slides are basically on that. This is the book he wrote in 1972, Gravitation and Cosmology, where I'll show you the highlights. The upper half is from the preface, which says that I found most textbooks geometric ideas were given starring roles, and that a student who asks why gravitational field is represented by metric tensor or why freely falling particles move on geodesics, etc., went away with the impression that this had something to do with the fact that space-time is Riemannian manifold, some rubric. Of course, this was Einstein's point of view, and his preeminent genius guides us. However, and then on I picked this from somewhere later, but in the same book, says the important thing is to be able to make predictions about images on astronomers' photographic plates, frequencies of spectral lines, and so on. And it simply doesn't matter whether we ascribe these predictions to the physical effects of gravitational fields on motions of planets and photons, or to a curvature of space and time. So to him, ultimately, all the elegance was good to have, but the bedrock was really these methods of calculation. And you really didn't have to be living in the cloud if you just wanted the answers, so the touchstone of everything was to be able to explain the spots on astronomers' plates. And of course, he adds the warning that these views are heterodox and would meet with, but since 1972, the views have been propounded, and of course, there are people for it and against it. And I picked 2 pages out of that book because until then, relativity books were all filled with beautiful and elegant maths and proofs and classifications of kind of metrics and so on. This is a book that has in it the microwave background radiation data, which was discovered in 1964. So this is just about 7 or 8 years later. He has written all the experiments that have at different frequency points the CMB, the cosmic microwave background, measured. And I sometimes wonder, because I don't think he had any graduate students. One of our senior colleagues, Professor Patil, remembers meeting him sometime in Berkeley or Los Angeles, and says Weinberg was all red-faced and he said, I cannot handle graduate students. So I don't think this work was done by anybody else. He must have personally sat and gone through all of these, gathering these numbers. You can also see the reference number is J prime, K prime, because he probably had to insert them later. This kind of attention to experimental detail and to match it to general covariance, outcome of general covariance. This rigor from end to end was really was the hallmark of his work. A lot of people have followed it, he's not alone in it, but really to bring it all under one roof. And so this became a comprehensive book that all particle physicists read.
Urjit, if I may add, that same book also has a wonderful chapter on how astronomers and cosmologists measure cosmic distances.
Yes. The cosmic ladder. Yes, so what we might call phenomenological cosmology was really brought together by him under one book, and with insights from from quantum field theory. He is writing this book about a decade after, or maybe 5 or 6 years after he has proved that a massless spin 2 particle had to lead to Einstein relativity, the theorem that I talked about earlier, that masslessness implies gauge invariance. So the Einstein's general covariance actually follows from consistency of a massless spin 2 particle. Yeah, thanks. So yes, so the book is really an amazing collection of the full spectrum of things required to do theoretical physics in a way that it remains physics, doesn't go into a different domain.
Urjit, he has 2 field theory books also, right?
He has a 3-volume quantum field theory book.
Oh, there is a
Quantum,
3rd volume?
3rd volume is all supersymmetry.
Yeah. So
Yes.
first 2 volumes are field theory, last volume is about supersymmetry.
No, but they are all called quantum field theory 1, 2, and 3.
Okay.
Quantum 1 is the fundamentals, where I said this RQM equal to QFT paradigm. Volume 2 is gauge theories.
I have only first and second volume. I was not aware about the 3rd.
Yeah, the 3rd. Well, now you can skip it. Sorry. So no, it will still remain useful. So I was just going to say in continuation that several decades later, in 2008, he is what, 75 or so. He is grinding away at cosmology, because now really experiments are looking at the cosmic microwave background in great detail, really parts per million. And because the calculations become so complicated, there's real physics now. There's something like 13 billion years ago, a hydrogen gas cooled down, and from ionized hydrogen, it became neutral hydrogen, and the photons it released are reaching us after 13 billion years. And the physics of this streaming through all the galaxies and everything, to capture it requires immense amount of detail. And of course, the professional astrophysicists and cosmologists, what could they do? They have to get the answer. So they developed efficient computer programs and fed all the Boltzmann equations and all the data into it. And they were using it. Weinberg said, well, but that gives us no insight into what's really happening. So he wrote out this whole book in early 2000s. At one point, so I have actually been reading this book for my purpose right now. So the results obtained so far are repulsively complicated, he says, but then delves right back into it. And the whole repulsive calculation fills that whole 600-page book. This book he wrote in 2008. I cannot say anything more. I'm really over my time. What should I do? Can I go on? Big crusader for enlightenment. He, in one of the convocations speeches, he said this: to join him as allies in the movement that is about 300 years old, the movement known as enlightenment.
HOD has disappeared.
Okay, so Ashmita, you are in charge. If you allow me, I'll go on.
No,
So,
I mean, I don't know.
Anyway, so, well, anyway, anybody who wants to go away is free to go away. I hope, Soumya, it doesn't matter if I go on for another 15 minutes or so, because I won't finish before that. The Enlightenment has made the world freer and gentler place through its emphasis on power of reason and its skepticism about many traditional social, political, and religious ideas. So he did become somewhat strident later on religion as well. And one of these debates, it's a joke. He said, Weinberg cited the flaming sword of Book of Genesis and said, if I'm really, going against God, then God should send down his flaming sword, might descend from above and strike him dead. And the person who is debating with him, also a physicist, but he's a priest. So he says that would be a theological problem. And Weinberg laughs and says, well, theological or not, I don't know, but it would be a janitorial problem if my head would be chopped off on the stage right now. It will have to be, big cleanup would be required. This is one of his more memorable statements. Religion is an insult to human dignity. With or without it, you have good people doing good things and evil people doing bad things. But for good people to do bad things, it takes religion. So he's talking about religion as a brainwash, organized religion, the role it plays in brainwashing people into doing things that are counter to basic humanity. And then some personal reminiscence. I wanted to show that I had these other mentors as well at Texas Austin, John Wheeler, Sudarshan, who was actually my thesis advisor, and also Joe Polchinski. And we also had quantum gravity from the Witts and Teitelbaum. So this is the last slide, but there are several points on it, and these are my personal reminiscences. And I like this picture because I think this blackboard is where I must have stood in front of him and written things down when I got the opportunity to speak to him. First joke is about his arriving at Texas. He had been in Berkeley and in Howard most of his life, MIT and Howard most of his life, Northeast. And then he arrived in Texas just the year I reached there in 1980 or a semester before. And I remember this distinctly. One of my first or second year in the elevator, I ended up getting in with him early in the morning, the first classes. And there was this tall Texan boy who got in fact, probably wearing a Texan hat. And they are typically 6 foot plus. And this boy says loudly as the lift starts, he says, "Good morning, Professor Weinberg." And then Weinberg is just staring straight, he doesn't move. And then the kid gets off at the very next level because classrooms are on that level. And then we all reach the 9th floor, which is the theory floor. And there was another faculty member in the lift. So as the lift, after the boy got out, Weinberg just grumbles. This is Texas, so I guess he is trying to be friendly to me, but I am not used to friendliness. And this was the tenor that remained most of the time. Weinberg remained unapproachable because he had no time to spend on anything except physics. No small talk, no nothing, no other interaction. And we had his quantum field theory lectures for at least 4 consecutive semesters. I attended them, volume 1 and volume 2. Volume 3, I could attend partly, but not whole. I remember the question and answers that would follow in this or happen in this QFT lectures. Often people asked very quote stupid questions. They would ask very elementary questions because you didn't understand the level at which he was talking. However stupid a question you asked, he never made fun of it. He was always very careful. If it was something completely wrong, he basically sorted it out. He said, "I think you mean this, or that this is not making sense." Or he would say, "You should read up this book. You should read up the quantum mechanics book where this is, you should read Merzbacher's book or Schiff's book." That's what he would say. He would never say, "Oh, this is too elementary for me to answer. What are you doing in this class?" I also remember his Americanisms. He liked to say things like, "This is all very solid, this is all proved now." So I would say, "This is hotsy-totsy, this is perfectly done." And some derivations which were very simple and easy would say, "Oh, this goes to lickety-split." I don't know where these things came from. So his lectures were always memorable, and he issued handwritten notes after every 3-4 lectures. A chunk of paper would be put out as his handwritten notes. I think almost as a vengeance, he scrawled. He never liked to be very neat and clean. He didn't want to show he was scholarly in awe of physics or science or anything. He just wanted it out. He used to have these brown bag seminars, which meant brown bag in America meant the bag in which you carry your sandwich, a brown paper bag in which you carried your day sandwich. So Weinberg never had time to talk to others, but on every Tuesday, there was a designated day in the week, where you could all enter his office with your brown bag of sandwich, and he will have designated somebody to speak, or maybe more than one person to speak, and also whatever he had in mind from reading the preprints and emerging ideas. But this is where it was your chance to speak. So my APS, if you wish, were given in front of Weinberg twice. I got about 10 minutes each time. Both the times you would get huge reaction to whatever you said. Doesn't make sense, it's not right, it's etc. But I remember that after the first one ended, he said, that's an important idea. And that became my thesis. And another one that I gave also was interesting. It was this after the talk is, so the second time I spoke in front of him, he really couldn't agree with what I was saying. But I was reassured by Joe Polchinski, who was sitting in the back of the room, and he kept nodding at me like this. And then Polchinski also interjected and tried to explain to Steve what the point was. So when that got over, of course, I was a little demoralized, but I had also got the strength to fight back with Steve because Joe was agreeing with me from the back. And then it got over and I left. I went to George Sudarshan's room because of discussing something. As it happened, Weinberg had some meeting to attend along with Sudarshan. So he came rushing into Sudarshan's room. George. And then he suddenly sees me standing there. And then he says, oh. And then he says, oh, you know, I hope you don't mind. He meant the treatment I got from him there. He said, when I'm trying to understand something, I get like that. These were the exact words he said. And whoosh, he left with Sudarshan. So he had no real time and he knew that he was being brusque, but he didn't intend to be any rude to you. And that really was very reassuring to me. And then after my thesis was over, he took me on as an associate, research associate. So I was with him, used to go for lunches with him to faculty lounge there. Of course, it would be a darbar of 10 or 12 people every time, visitors from all over the world. His 3 or 5 postdocs, he had very senior scientists. So we would all be piling up on some table. They were all great experiences. I remember one of them, somebody asked him, but why did you not prove renormalizability of electroweak? Because it was left to Gerhard et Hooft and Weltman to prove. And he said, well, those were the years I got involved with SALT II, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty for Nuclear Balance, the Cold War era. So SALT II, level 2 treaties had to be finalized, and he was involved in this policy and traveling to Washington, DC. So that's at least what he said. And of course, he was a big champion of the Super Collider, which finally was allotted to Texas, except that eventually USA thought it was too much money to spend and shut it. But he brought the SSC to Texas. And when I was leaving finally, after I got offer from TIFR, he sort of didn't believe that I would go away back to India. And he said, are you sure you want to go? And I said, yes. Then I asked him, but will you remember me? And he said, yes, your thesis is right there with those of my students. And I said, thank you. And then whenever I have written emails to him for any guidance or help, which was not too often, it was once in 5 years, he has always been prompt in replying. And I had a very recent exchange with him, which I've shared with some of my colleagues. So thank you for your patience. And if you are still there, and so to everybody who is still there, thank you for hearing me out and giving me this opportunity to recount these glorious times.
You didn't take any pictures with him?
No, pictures was not the thing in those days, because we were in a very different mold at that time. In fact,
and since he's unfriendly, you couldn't take, maybe, I don't know.
That was not so, that probably would have come in the way as well. In fact, cameras were not very common in those days. But what I do remember is that when after Salam visited in '83, he went back and created, I think, the World Academy of Sciences at that time in 1984. And the very first World Academy of Sciences prize that was given to George Sudarshan. I suspect that Sudarshan and Salam and Weinberg were now trying to promote George for the Nobel. 83 is the thing when George Sudarshan came very close to getting the Nobel Prize because it went in optics. So at that time, when he got that prize, somebody smuggled me into the faculty lounge because they had a faculty celebration because Sudarshan got the Third World Academy of Sciences Fellow Award and some $10,000 or some large prize. And somebody took a picture of me, Swadesh Mahajan, standing between Steven Weinberg and George Sudarshan. That's the only picture I had. Somehow that picture is lost now. So I tried to look for it a few years ago, but just couldn't locate it. That's the only picture I had. But I don't think many people have.
Your group lunch, there was no picture taken.
Oh, no. I think the whole atmosphere was so different. It was, everybody had just physics on their mind. Nobody was thinking of photographs.
But it's nice.
Yeah, it would have been, but yeah, maybe we didn't have people with that right perspective to. So should I stop sharing?
All these notes you have, the handwritten.
Yes. I had the handwritten notes, the scroll notes, all of them. They cover volume 1, 2, as well as 3. All the supersymmetry notes also I have gathered.
Okay.
And I also have unpublished string theory notes, 1 semester worth of string theory course that he gave.
Wow.
And I think he never published them because Joe Polchinski published his 2-volume string theory book.
After that only, right?
Yeah, so Polchinski published afterwards. Polchinski did this interesting one-loop calculation in string theory and then went on to do other interesting things. So I think Steve never went out with his book because actually Steve's book was more focused on various systemic issues that he had with string theory originating from S-matrix theory. So vertex operators and external legs and things of that kind. So I have a feeling that, but I think he does compactification, even the the famous Witten, Candelas, Horowitz, and that 4-author paper of compactification and Calabi-Yau. I think it's there in those lectures, but he didn't he didn't publish it. To my knowledge, I don't know whether he published, but I don't think so. But I have those notes if you want to see it.
Yeah, I want to see something. Yeah, I'll take it at some point.
Yes.
So,
Okay. Sorry, so I have
to
gone
hear
on.
your personal experience. Someone called Mala has written, nice to hear personal experiences.
Yes, Mala, I don't know if they're still around. Mala and her husband. Mala was my classmate in IIT Bombay. She was in mathematics PhD, mathematics MSc, but we are same batch. So as an alum, and now her kids are living on campus. So she's.
Oh, okay.
So we have got. So I just let her know.
Okay. Yeah, I don't see any other comments on the Zoom chat. No questions.
No questions. Okay.
Anybody else has any question? Uma Shankar left is what I heard. Yeah, I think we have
Exhausted your.
It was nice. I think.
Yeah, I mean, certainly some of these are things that one would tell over a longer time. I think you have to cram them in.
Yeah.
So feel free to chat with me anytime you want, and there are lots more to tell.
Okay. So maybe we can leave.
Yeah.
There are no further questions.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you all for
Thank you.